So there you were, in a sweaty, shoddy internet cafe with your friends, your eyes glued squarely to the screen, Linkin Park and MCR playing in the background. You can hear Chester's screams amid all the trash talking. The game you're playing? Dota. Or is it League? Special Force? You're not even sure anymore. Doesn't matter, you're focused. Every set, clash, assist, kill, accompanied by a chorus of unintelligible yells, and you still haven't finished the half-eaten pancit canton by the left side of your desk. Makunat na yan mamaya, chong. Keyboard, laspag. Mouse, laspag. Headphones, don't even bother. Atmosphere, tense. Stench, yeah, it's there. Classes, you skipped them for the day. What the hell were you thinking? But again, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. You're locked in because you're having the time of your life. You were all having the time of your lives. If anything I said earlier resonated with you, that means we most likely came up in the same era. I grew up a gamer, much like you. I'm aware that the term has lost almost all meaning nowadays, what with games being so accessible, so within reach, but we grew up in the early 2000s, and being a gamer during that time, it was a bit different. It hit different. Especially if you were in the Philippines, especially if you grew up in the province. I'm sure a lot of you know what I mean. It was an era where modern game consoles were rare in the boonies, so you really had to be dedicated. You really had to go out of your way sometimes, well, most of the time, to play games, specifically PC games with friends, or sometimes even just yourself. What with PCs and internet cafes often being better than the ones you'd have at home, assuming you even had one at home, assuming you even had a fast enough internet connection to support your multiplayer needs. I'm a Gen Z kid, but I'm kind of a middle child in a sense. I was born early 97, very early 97, and like I mentioned, I grew up mostly in the province, so things came to us slow during that time. We just weren't as up-to-date with all the trends as compared to Metro Manila, and most of the friends I made back in the day were a bit older than I was. I think the point that I'm getting at is that I grew up almost like a millennial, or that the distinction between Gen Z and millennial doesn't really exist in this context. The fact of the matter is I'm a product of the early to late 2000s, and in turn I picked up on a lot of early 2000s sensibilities. And those affected my interests, habits, and values, then naturally the era influenced the type of games I played growing up, and how I played and absorbed them. So going back, I want to talk about these games, the ones that made me, that made us. I want to talk about them and the lessons we learned from them as kids. I've been itching to get in on this topic for a while now, so I'm gonna do just that. And I'll be bringing a few friends over this time around. This is the first in a multi-part video series where I'll be talking about the Filipino gaming experience throughout the 2000s, all the way to the early 2010s, both mine and yours. Welcome to our attempt at putting into words the feelings that our shared and individual experiences with these games evoked. Our love letter to this tiny little pocket in gaming history. This is growing up as an average Filipino gamer in the 2000s, Part 1. And these are the games that made us. Starting with online FPS games. If there was one type of game that oversaturated the market during the 2000s all the way into the early 2010s, it was this. The online military FPS. Games like Special Force, KOS, Crossfire, take your pick. Every internet cafe, storefront, or glass door would often have posters of either these games or whichever RPG was trendy at the time plastered all over them. And I always thought they were pretty cool. I've always had a healthy respect for them, even though I never really got good at them. But before all that, I don't think it would be fair to continue this subject without first giving recognition to the granddaddy of them all, Counter-Strike. Let me get into a bit of a personal story. I was only a year old when Half-Life came out, so suffice it to say, I didn't get in on it immediately. But when I finally did attain the slightest bit of cognitive function, I do recall watching my dad play Counter-Strike a lot, both with bots and with uncles I never knew. Yeah, he was also a gamer. He's the one who got me into it. Mind you, during this time where I would regularly watch him play video games, he had already let me play my fair share of strategy games and platformers. So I had an idea how games looked and played, but I remember Counter-Strike being a bit odd compared to most other games I've seen and played. It was different, and I felt the same way for when I first booted up Half-Life. Looking back, I think that distinction became even more punctuated upon playing Half-Life. See, eventually, little child me, in spite of his father's insistence in not booting up Half-Life, booted it up anyway. Quick aside for those who don't know, Half-Life is the base game to Counter-Strike. We'll talk about that in a bit. And this palpable distinction compared to every other game from every other genre was the through line, the commonality for all FPS games that I played immediately after Counter-Strike and Half-Life. This led me down a rabbit hole of FPS games that I'm still plummeting downward in to this day. Like I said, I respect the genre. It's just that I never really got good at it in a competitive sense. But what did I mean earlier? How exactly are FPS games different? Well, let's get into that very briefly. I think generally it boils down to two things, with another factor to consider when it comes to competitive tactical shooters. Let's talk about the point of view first. Every other video game I played prior to Half-Life, with the exception of maybe Jumpstart Toddlers, had you, the one holding the controller or the mouse and keyboard, controlling some sort of character that's being displayed on screen, reacting to your controller inputs by giving a visual approximation of which button you're hitting. Whether it's a platformer with just one player character or a strategy game with multiple units following your mouse clicks, there's always a conduit, an avatar, separate from yourself, by which your input is given visual feedback, the player character, or units. This isn't the case for FPS games. They put you right in the middle of the action. You are the player character here. There is no conduit. There is no separate thing you can look at to know if you're jumping or shooting. When you hit that spacebar, you're jumping in first person. When you left click, you're shooting in first person. Virtually. This melted little kid Dwight's brain, but he understood intuitively. These are my limbs. This is my hand holding a crowbar, and when I left click, I'm swinging it. Virtually. It was simple, and it made sense, and it was wildly different from every other game I've played at that point. Looking back as an adult, I understand now that the first key difference is that the point of view made things intimate. Speaking of intimacy, the second thing that makes FPS games different is atmosphere, or immersion, or whatever you'd like to call it. A benefit inherent to FPS games is, like I mentioned, it puts you front and center. You're experiencing everything your character is experiencing, visually. This lends a lot to atmosphere and immersion. And it wasn't just the point of view that lent to the atmosphere. It was also the distinct visual and sound design of each game. FPS games, by virtue of them being shooters, had the allowance to be gritty, violent, and exude some semblance of realism. And that allowance shines through in the sound of bullets crackling, people letting out death growls, and at the time, the graphic visual depictions of gore and violence. We see this being put to good use in games like classic Deus Ex, which puts you in the middle of a cyberpunk dystopia before Cyberpunk 2077 was even a thing. No One Lives Forever, which puts you in the shoes of a 1980s covert ops agent. Even Counter-Strike, which made you feel like an actual special ops military dude with the realistic sound effects and the walkie-talkie voiceovers. And especially in horror-themed FPS games like Resident Evil 7, for a more modern example, which is widely regarded as the scariest RE game. And well, Half-Life. Half-Life scared the ever-living crap out of me as a kid, mostly because, again, by virtue of it being an FPS game, I was right there. Right there fighting low-poly aliens and watching low-poly people get decapitated. Add to that the sound design, the eerie ambient noises, the growls these monsters let out, the humans screaming for their lives, the sound of their blood and guts splattering as they eventually get mangled. It was something else. It was this cacophony of very eerie and violent elements all clicking and working together to form a shit-inducing whole. It felt like the first time I was fully absorbed by a video game, that I was part of its world. This is what I mean by immersion. Half-Life, due in large part to it being a first-person shooter, facilitated an atmosphere that had you fully engaged, involved, and clinging to every moment. And again, this isn't exclusive to just horror-leaning FPS games. I'm pretty sure every FPS game I played during that period left me fully immersed. So now we've established what made FPS games as a whole completely different. What about online military shooters? What makes them different? I think that it's simply the competitive aspect of these games. Circling back to Counter-Strike, I found out through my dad later on that it was what we refer to now as a community mod. It was made by two aspiring video game developers who wanted to put their own spin on the base game. The mod itself was just meant to convey one of the developers' interest at the time in counter-terrorist operations, which he already attempted with his Quake mod and predecessor to Counter-Strike, Navy SEALs, but that's a story for another time. Counter-Strike attempted to achieve the developer's end goal through simple but mechanically rewarding tactical gameplay. CS was simple as in it was pure. It didn't have a shit ton of interlocking gameplay or movement systems. It didn't have a post-game progression or reward mechanic. It wasn't riddled with the pay-to-win bullshit we have nowadays, but I digress. It was simple as in all of you move at the same pace depending on which gun you carry. I am not gonna discuss bunny hopping. All of you died easily and all of you had to resource manage. Customization was done by way of buying guns and other equipment at the start of every round. It happens during the gameplay session. And you would think that given how simple it is, it'd be a cakewalk for anyone trying to get into it, but no, the game was absolutely brutal. Again, time to kill was quick, and if you sucked, you will know that you sucked throughout the duration of a gameplay session. Its simplicity actually informs the mechanical depth of the game. Given how non-intrusive and even all of the gameplay systems were, players, as in the good ones, expressed their skill by how well they exploit or traverse through the game's existing systems. The game rewards proper team coordination, positioning, weapon rotations, shot calling, and map knowledge by way of the smoke nades and flashbangs, and obviously, accurate aim. Again, the developers wanted to make the mod stand out by translating that feeling of being a counter-terrorist spec ops agent into gameplay, so they did exactly that. And you weren't rewarded by way of skins or better kill streak perks or loot boxes. No, those didn't exist yet back in the day. You were rewarded through simple recognition. See, local internet cafe scenes were intimate then. Everyone knew who the regulars were, and the good players, especially, were held in high regard. The incentive system was mostly mechanized by word of mouth. It was that simple, that pure, and it worked. There was no better feeling way back when than being called a pro or a mamau as a term of endearment, and that gave you more incentive to keep being good and to be better. That's what competition meant back in the day. Players constantly striving to be good by way of mechanical mastery. So interest in the game, informed partly by the recognition of these players, proliferated through word of mouth. Then communities and cliques were formed around the game. It was organic. Beautiful, really. And this wasn't exclusive to just the Philippines. If you were to take a deep dive into the history of Counter-Strike, you would see that it's almost the same case when it comes to the local scenes of other countries. Before Counter-Strike was fully integrated into esports, the really good players, the really good teams became regional then national legends first, competing in their own circuits. This DNA carried through to the games that followed. Special Force, Crossfire, KOS. Admittedly, not all of these games quite captured the purity and mechanical depth of Counter-Strike, some of them opting to be hybrids of CS and other multiplayer shooters like Call of Duty, but they applied the same model for building their communities. Even though loadouts, microtransactions, and other modes of progression and incentivization were slowly creeping into these games at the time, at their very core is that principle of community building through goodwill, competition, and recognition. That's what made online FPS games different, and I feel like that's why we got hooked into them so much. Right now, in modern day, Counter-Strike is bigger than ever, fostering one of the biggest and most well-regarded esports scenes in the world. Moreover, we have games like Valorant and Rainbow Six Siege, all backed up by AAA developers, jockeying for position in this tactical shooter market. And it was all enabled by these core fundamentals. The things that made FPS games, and online FPS games, different. RPG games. This was written by my friend Carl. Imagine this. You're a second grade kid from the Philippines who was recently introduced to the culture of internet cafes. All your life you thought video games were just a bunch of linear one-player games which, when the levels get too hard for your underdeveloped brain and hand-eye coordination to deal with, you just see the dreaded game over screen and you need to start from the beginning for the umpteenth time. And then one day, you see one grown-up kid in this dingy computer rental place playing a game that doesn't seem to end. You see a character they customized, and you see them literally getting stronger the more of these hideous creatures they slay in the coolest, edgiest way that then early 2000s era graphics could muster. That was my introduction to my first real RPG. The game specifically was Diablo 2. It was this gory, dark, very demonic-themed game released by Blizzard way back in the year 2000. And at that time, I couldn't see any game cooler than that. The game lets you pick from 7 different classes that specialize in different kinds of weaponry and modes of warfare, depending on what style the player would most prefer. You would follow a loose storyline that lets you freely explore the map, slaying monsters, gaining experience, acquiring weapons and equipment of different strengths and rarities. These various items also give you different effects that may or may not stack to make your character stronger. And of course, your character has a skill tree that contains skills and spells which you can improve the more your character levels up. Also customizable, of course, to the player's discretion. If you think that all of these are just features of your standard run-of-the-mill RPG, well, that's because they are today, but not to that wide-eyed kid 20 years ago immersed in this new world he found within the walls of that internet cafe. Frankly speaking, RPGs and MMORPGs are the genre that made me hooked into gaming. So I wanted to talk about the top 3 games that shaped the gamer that I am today. And I want to maybe reminisce about the good old days, and the good old games that pinned down what made RPGs and MMORPGs that addictive. What qualities did these games possess that made millions upon millions played for years on end, and maybe even remember them fondly long after they've been buried deep into the digital sands of time. Let's start with freedom and self-expression. One of the most enticing features of RPGs, I would say, is its ability to let players express themselves through character customization. Gamers, especially in the olden days, are some of the most introverted people you can find on the internet. We are not big on self-expression as we fear possible scrutiny and ridicule from other people. So RPGs giving us a choice as to what character we want to play as, and a way for us to play it the way we want it, contributes to a lot of its allure. Diablo 2 did that for me. It may not be as deep into character customization as the games we have today. We can edit even facial features down to the most unique detail nowadays. But Diablo 2 gave me a way to uniquely express myself through that game. While everyone was picking assassins for their highest physical damage or wizards for the flashy spells and combos, I was content being a druid, summoning my vines and my friendly crow and transforming into a vicious wolf or bear depending on what I want. And that was the point of it all. The game lets me decide. I had strict parents and I studied in a Catholic school, so for the first time ever, in this tiny digital box, I have an ungodly amount of deciding power. I didn't have to conform to what these older kids are telling me, what build I should do, what's the strongest class to pick. I decide. I play this game the way I want to, and the game was happy enough to let me. The open world adventure. Continuing on with the theme of freedom in this genre, let's talk about the way that the game's environment is set up for the player to explore. No RPG is complete without a world for the player to roam around and create adventures in, but I guess it's not just how free the player is to explore the world inside the game, but rather how immersed the game makes one feel. Take Pokemon, for example, particularly the Gold, Silver, Crystal generation, or the second generation. It's not particularly what one would categorize as open world, since the player is set on a path that the game has designed for you to follow in order to progress. The game does, however, allow you to progress at your own pace. Whether you want to grind and demolish all the Sentrets and Hoot-Hoots in your area, or blitz through the whole of Johto and Kanto for that bragging right of a speedrun record time, it's your adventure. You're free to do what you want, and again, it might not be as free as one would expect in, say, Breath of the Wild or Minecraft, which might be considered the pinnacle of open world, but the immersion in the second generation Pokemon games is still undeniably top tier. You see, GSC is a direct sequel to the first generation of Pokemon games. As someone who actually played each version in chronological order, that was a big deal. I remember playing the first generation games from 3rd grade until 5th grade before I got my hands on that coveted 2nd generation cartridge. I was a bit bummed at first that I won't be returning as Red, the character I wholeheartedly loved playing in the first generation, but after getting my first Pokemon from Professor Elm, everything was just shaping up to be a core memory for me. The new aesthetic, new features, new mechanics, apricorns turning into balls, it's a whole new world to explore. Then the bombshell came. The new region, Johto, is directly connected to the region in the first game, Kanto. Never has any video game made me feel as giddy and excited as that discovery. It's a kind of high one chases after for a lifetime. I thought that the Easter eggs just stopped at Professor Oak's appearance at the start of the game and the remnants of Team Rocket at Radio Tower. I never expected I would be able to explore the world I learned to love for 3 years and see what has progressed, what has changed. And sure, there have been dozens and dozens of videos talking about and criticizing Kanto and GSC, calling it underwhelming, but I don't see it that way. What I felt when I arrived at Kanto for the first time was, oh, The game removed my training wheels. It's just going to be me from here on. And of course, the culmination of my adventure, beating all the gyms in Kanto, fighting the improved Elite Four, going deep into the caves of the mysterious Mount Silver, I find red. No words spoken, just me and my former self from one generation ago, duking it out. It's so beautiful. It's almost poetic. Social interaction. Question: what happens when you cross the RPG genre with the early 2000s boom of the internet? The answer is the MMORPG. Massive multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG, is a video game genre so popular in the 2000s that a now legendary Pinoy rock band even made a song about probably the most popular MMORPG in the Philippines at that time. Kamikaze's Chicxilog talks about the budding romance of two Ragnarok online players that quickly went south in a comedic fashion after the two lovebirds tried to meet online. But we're not here to talk about the song, so let's talk about the game. Ragnarok Online is an MMORPG based on the Korean manhwa of the same name by Lee Myung-jin. It's heavily inspired by Norse mythology and was at one time the biggest MMORPG here in the Philippines. And for a good reason. Back in those days, multiplayer games were really not found a lot outside of console games having a second controller for player 2. But the boom of the internet paved the way for gamers to be able to interact online inside a video game. Again, I was a massive introvert. I did not make friends easily when I was younger, but the whole design of an MMORPG is made so that players would have a massive advantage when they interact and make friends with each other. And when I played Ragnarok, I was mega hooked. I wanted to be able to explore the world in all its dangerous places, and I can only do that with the help of other players. So I was able to make friends, or rather, I was forced to, despite me being an introvert. And I can honestly say that those were one of the best gaming memories I have to this day. Countless hours of grinding for those ever so elusive monster cards and drops, farming the required items to craft that one last piece of equipment to complete your build, hanging out in the crowded marketplace of Frontera, or maybe chilling under the serene trees in Payon, selling your plus 10 mace and drop cards and Yggdrasil berries. And the guild wars. Man, the guild wars. The whole gang is there and everyone is talking strategies, guarding your own Imperium and infiltrating the rivaling guild's base. A lot of core memories are being formed and we didn't even know it. And so, I guess that's what makes RPGs very alluring to its players. The adventure of a lifetime. With friends, digital and real, in a world that's yours to conquer. I'm still a bit confused as to which video game I remember first playing. I've heard conflicting reports here and there, too. What I am sure of is that it was a strategy game, either Civilization 3 or Red Alert 2. Yes, I played these games before my parents made me play Jumpstart Toddlers. Cool, right? Though they belong to the same genre, they couldn't have been any more different. Civilization put you in the shoes of an actual historical leader. It had you playing through a fictionalized version of Earth or something close, advancing your civ through millennia and through different time periods. It was a slow, methodical, turn-based 4X game that had multiple victory routes for one single-player session, which were notoriously long, by the way. It challenged your critical thinking, reading comprehension, planning and problem-solving skills, and rewarded your ingenuity, micromanagement, and most importantly, patience. You really needed to understand the game and how its plethora of moving parts interacted in order to get the most out of it. So it was a matter of trial and error to start with, and then a matter of making the most out of what's given to you once you've gotten the hang of it. To this day, I still love and enjoy Civ and other 4X games, be it in its quote-unquote purest form in Civ 5, its funnest form in Civ 6, or even its more modern descendants like Dune Spice Wars and Humankind. Red Alert 2, on the other hand, was a frenetic, wacky, in-your-face, balls-to-the-wall frenzy. It put you in the shoes of a commander, controlling in real time the weirdest units one's mind could conjure up. From unnecessarily patriotic foot soldiers and dogs that could one-shot said foot soldiers to straight-up telekinetic dolphins, giant missile-dropping blimps, to friggin' flying saucers. The unit variety in this game was insane, and this zaniness shines through the most in the single-player campaign, which puts you in a time-traveling quest to crush either the Allies or the Soviets, depending on which faction you chose, and eventually thwart the plans of the big bad. This guy, the mind-controlling Yuri. Red Alert was fast-paced, and as I would later find out, faster than a majority of its RTS peers such as StarCraft, which we'll get to in a bit. And though it also challenged your problem-solving, resource, and micromanagement skills, it also pushed you to think on the fly, to quickly adapt to the enemy team's strategy and to play aggressive. See, unlike playing Civ single-player, Red Alert didn't afford you the luxury of turn-based gameplay. It didn't give you the same room to breathe and analyze the entire situation before making a move. It was dynamic. Every drastic decision you make in RA2, like sending in your entire army to an enemy base or clashing with the enemy team for that oil derrick, had immediate effects. And there was only one victory route: crush your enemies. If I sound like I have a preference for RA2 over Civ 3, I assure you that I don't. I love these two games and their franchises equally. Maybe except for CNC4. And truth be told, I've actually spent more hours on Civ than any other game franchise ever. These two titles formed my identity as a gamer. They became the yardstick for every game that followed. They made this dichotomy that exists inside me to this day. The part of me as a gamer that looks for fun, frenetic energy, and the part that wants patient, plodding, tactical gameplay. They set up my expectations as a gamer both in the way that stories are told and the way that games would actually feel and play. I love them dearly for what they are. And my love for these two games became the jumping off point for my time with Blizzard's take on the strategy genre. Now listen, StarCraft 1 set a new standard for me in terms of video game storytelling, and StarCraft 2 is literally my favorite RTS game of all time. It's a masterful piece of media that didn't just nail the RTS formula to a T, but also concluded one of my favorite video game stories ever, and I do not care how many times you tell me that the campaigns of both games were corny. I lapped up every single second of that glorious train wreck. Now, I can talk about these games individually, but I would just sound redundant if I were to do that, because these games to me exhibited the best traits of the previous RTS game that I've mentioned. Their key differences being that they were a tad more methodical and micro-intensive, they made faction diversity way more integral to the core gameplay, and they improved, then eventually pretty much perfected in StarCraft 2, at least for me, how single-player narratives and progression should be integrated in RTS games. These key differences became hallmarks for Blizzard's take on the genre. But let's push further. What I really want to talk about is Warcraft 3, and the revolution it unintentionally set in motion. See, Warcraft 3 did a few things that changed the gaming industry forever. On Blizzard's end, it set up the foundation by which World of Warcraft's lore and world would be built on, and we all know how successful WoW ended up being. It expanded on the concept of commando units, giving birth to the hero units we know and love today, and it gave its players a toolset where they could build not only their own custom maps for Warcraft 3, but quite literally their own little games. And on the community's end, they made this tiny little custom map that would end up becoming an international phenomenon, overshadowing even the RTS genre itself. And I think you already know where this is going. The last type of game I'll be talking about for this video will be the MOBA, the multiplayer online battle arena. I can talk about what makes MOBA games different in a general sense, but I don't think that would be necessary. We all know how a MOBA game plays and feels. It's the most played gaming genre in the Philippines, even to this day. I can talk in depth about the elements that it incorporated and expanded on from base Warcraft 3 like neutral camps, item building, and the heroes themselves, but again, given our familiarity with MOBAs, I don't think that would be entirely necessary. I can even talk about its origins, discuss how its general gameplay loop and map design was inspired by Aeon of Strife, which was also a custom map but built for StarCraft 1, or how it was the brainchild of a dude named Yule, then subsequently passed down to other map designers till it found its way to IceFrog, but I think its history is a discussion for another time. This video is supposed to capture what made growing up as a gamer in the Philippines different, and no other game, I believe, encapsulates the feeling of the experience being different in the Philippines better than Dota. That's what I want to convey here. So we should talk about its competitive culture, right? I don't think so either. I've already had a discussion on that a few odd minutes ago. That would just be redundant. Everything I said about the competitive culture for online FPS games applies to Dota as well. It also rewards mechanical mastery through goodwill and recognition. It also fostered community building through those foundations. No, I really want to hone in on the word different. And to do that, we need to talk about how living through the Dota era made us feel. So let's get personal. This was written by my friend, Henry. I was in 4th grade when I transferred to a public elementary school after being bullied by a teacher in Montessori for being too weird. Honestly, she was right. I was awkward and a bit eccentric. I didn't understand social cues or the concept of fitting in. I acted on impulse and that alienated a lot of people. I was ostracized for the most part, especially during that private school to public school adjustment period, but I did converse with my classmates from time to time. We would talk about games, Pokemon, Battle Realms, Warcraft 3. During 5th grade, one of my classmates approached me, asking if I knew about Dota, to which I responded, "What the hell's a Dota?" He then tells me that it's a custom map for Warcraft and that since I liked Warcraft so much, I should maybe check it out, play with bots, and download Garena so we can maybe play together. We never did end up playing together, but I did check Dota out and I fell almost immediately in love. I felt like it doubled down on what made Warcraft different, the heroes, and removed all the micro-intensive stuff. Not that I didn't like controlling massive armies, I did, but Dota felt more intimate and personal. Like the amount of choices presented infinite possibilities and the hero was a blank canvas you could pour yourself into, express yourself through. I wouldn't say I got pretty good at it though. I played a pretty decent Razor and Ursa. I remember pub stomping in Garena when Slark dropped with update 6.65. But other than that, I'd say that I was pretty average, sometimes below average. See, there were layers upon layers of mechanics and exploits that Dota demanded mastery of, and though I did try my best to get a general sense of how everything worked, my tiny pea-brain could only handle so much. So my Dota knowledge was nothing to scoff at, but it wasn't anything special. What it was, in actuality, was a passport. Something that I could use to finally make friends. And I used this to my benefit when I finally learned to pick up on social cues and moved on to high school. Dota was popping off at the time. It wasn't just a custom map anymore. You had the in air quotes game itself and then the subculture behind it. Memes, merch, fan art, fanfics, literal songs that played on mix and in the radio. Dota became part of pop culture at the time. Lifelong bonds were forged by this game. Friend groups were built and torn apart by it. Every game had a baseline level of trash talking, and internet cafe sessions would sometimes devolve into literal physical brawls because of it. We were so passionate about Dota that by the time Dota 2 found its competitive peak, we became acknowledged by its current custodian, Lord Gaben, and the international community as a whole. High school me wanted in on all of that action, so in I went. I made it my mission to make friends through Dota, and so I did. Later on, we became a group of friends. And then an even bigger group. We would jump straight to the nearest internet cafe after class. Sometimes we'd cut classes entirely just so we could play. There was even this one time where our homeroom advisor barged into the internet cafe we were playing in just to confirm that we were there and report us to our parents. I received a mouthful from mine. I'm pretty sure the same happened to them, but still we kept at it. We kept playing with and against each other. And even though it wasn't always W's and happy faces, oftentimes we'd even straight up suck at the game, we kept at it because regardless, it was fun. Bonding with my friends with Dota as the backdrop was an amazing experience, and I'm sure they all felt the same way. And our time enjoying the game wasn't confined to just within the walls of those dingy internet cafes. Oftentimes, either before or after a play session, we'd hang out at nearby canteens or roadside turo-turo carts where we'd eat fishball, drink shady mystery juice, and talk about Dota, or even just how our days went, or just life in general. We would have in-jokes, we would banter with each other. It's like we had our own secret language. This was us building up our friendships through our shared love of Dota. And eventually, our common love of the game took a backseat to just our enjoyment of each other's company. But every now and then, it wouldn't just be the enjoyment that we'd play for. Sometimes it'd be a matter of pride. Our time playing with each other would often culminate into pustahan games against either students from a different section or a different school. And these play sessions had an air of intensity about them. One, because there's money at stake, and two, because it gives your group a chance to show off to other groups how good you guys are. Gave you guys street cred. It was a decent test of skill, but I never really partook in these play sessions because I personally didn't want to. I, nonetheless, enjoyed cheering my friends on because win or lose, we'd still be hanging out anyway. We'd still have something to talk about and remember fondly. This was our routine, and this went on until we graduated. Of course, members of the group would sometimes have to pause when a significant life event happens or if they'd find other interests, like me meeting my first girlfriend, or one member of the group joining the high school band, or one of us getting extremely sick, but it didn't matter. Through the bonds that we built in our play sessions and pre or post-game hangouts, we knew that there would always be somewhere we could come back to, each other, Dota or no Dota. Needless to say, I loved my time in high school. And Dota became my key to enjoying it. It was my starting point, and I miss you, guys. I've since moved on to League of Legends. Unlike Dota, I got really good at it, both in PC and Wild Rift. Diamond 2 highest rank, baby. Some of my friends moved on to Mobile Legends and then Honor of Kings, but we've become adults since then. Our time doesn't revolve around playing these games anymore. We play them when it's convenient. I have a life now. I graduated college. I'm doing grown-up things, same with my friends. Some of them have moved up in society, becoming business people, employed professionals. Some taking up grad school, some building their own businesses. Some have even settled down and established their own families, but in our heart of hearts, whenever we're together, we knew that we'd always be those same kids. Those bad-mouthing idiots that sucked at this one game but still played regardless. Those trolls who were inseparable, who'd get into all sorts of trouble, who had the time of their lives whenever they're sad together. Those memories that were made, those bonds that were built, those stupid-ass shenanigans that we'd get ourselves into with what little we had. That's what made gaming in the Philippines different. It was a shared experience, a communal experience. There was respect and genuine passion for it. And it helped me and a lot of us grow as people.